London, 1888. The air was thick, almost viscous, as though the city itself had grown sentient, inhaling centuries of soot, disease, and the whispered sins of generations. Gas lamps flickered along Whitechapel's narrow alleys, their yellow light slicing through the ever-present fog, a fog that clung to brick and stone and flesh alike, muting footsteps, swallowing shapes, and allowing shadows to walk independently of the living. There, in the suffocating darkness, something older than crime stirred, something that had learned to hide behind the mask of man, yet moved with an intelligence that no mortal could comprehend. The story of Jack the Ripper is commonly told as though it began with murder, yet the true beginning is older, hidden in the musty vaults of London's police archives, concealed in letters marked confidential, in hushed whispers among those who lived in Whitechapel's twisting alleys, who sensed a predatory presence before any headline screamed of blood. What haunted Whitechapel did not hunt for victims randomly, it sought symbols, and with each body it left a message carved into flesh, a statement to those who would dare to look closer. The cuts themselves were not merely wounds, they were rituals, and the city's authorities, too blinded by bureaucracy and corruption, would not see the meaning beneath the gore. The first cut upon Mary Ann Nichols was more than the slitting of a throat. It was the tearing apart of an invisible veil that had long kept London ignorant of its own darkness, and as the blood pooled on the uneven cobblestones, London felt an unfamiliar vulnerability, a shiver that spread not just through Whitechapel, but through the heart of the city itself. Dockworkers spoke of fog that thickened after the murders. Cab drivers whispered of a figure, well-dressed but moving as if untouchable, too practiced with a knife to be human, yet appearing as though London itself swallowed him, leaving only fear in his wake. As the press began to report, the Ripper was already a legend, yet legends are masks, and the mask he wore concealed a truth more unsettling than the murders themselves. For Jack the Ripper was not only a man, but an echo of the city's own sins, a shadow born from poverty, corruption, and the insatiable hunger of men who wielded power without conscience. The killings were no mere crimes of impulse. They were calculated performances, staged in darkness, executed with precision, designed to command attention, not just in the East End, but in the drawing rooms of those who believed themselves untouchable. And so, the Ripper's knife was sharp, but sharper still was the silence that followed, a silence that invited speculation, fear, and obsession, a silence that would haunt London for centuries to come, whispering truths too dangerous to speak aloud. Whitechapel was not merely a district, it was a wound, raw and festering beneath London's glittering West End, a wound that had never healed, reeking of gin, rotting refuse, and the despair of thousands forced to cram 10 souls into a single room. Survival was not life in Whitechapel, it was endurance through a slow, grinding decay. Men staggered drunk along alleys slick with filth, women sold themselves to feed children who cried in dark corners, and children stole scraps to stave off hunger, while rats proliferated more successfully than families. Thriving where life itself seemed fragile, the police patrolled reluctantly, shadows themselves afraid of the mob, their lanterns cutting weak slivers through the fog, barely illuminating the twisting passages where Jack the Ripper would one day strike, unseen, unheard, but not unfelt. Those who lived there sensed a change before the first body appeared, a heaviness in the fog, a presence that felt almost sentient, something that observed without eyes, a hunger that was not human, yet bore the patience of centuries. The Ripper did not emerge from nothing. He was born of Whitechapel itself, nourished by despair, anonymity, and chaos. Each crime a reflection of the district that created him, each shadow a partner in his work, each silence an accomplice. Yet the newspapers reported the murders as sudden thunder, as if from a clear sky, masking the truth, masking the warning that had been whispered for generations. What if, in reality, the victims were chosen not because they were vulnerable, but because they represented the invisible, the ignored, the expendable, a statement directed at those who read the papers in safe, gilded rooms, sipping tea while horror unfolded miles away. The precision of the cuts, the staging of the bodies, the letters sent to the press, all spoke not of frenzy, but of purpose, each act a perfect. Manse, Whitechapel the unwilling stage, its residents the chorus who trembled in darkness, unaware they were being watched, studied, manipulated. Jack the Ripper carved more than bodies. He carved fear into the conscience of a city that thought itself civilized. He drew attention to the rot that lurked beneath the veneer of progress, the rot that people pretended did not exist. And every night, as the fog rolled thicker and the gas lamps flickered, Whitechapel held its breath, waiting, knowing that the shadows were listening, waiting and learning. Mary Ann Nichols, called Polly, lay crumpled in a gutter when she was discovered, her throat grotesquely slashed, her abdomen mutilated, yet her pockets contained coins untouched, an almost defiant detail. For what kind of killer is so meticulous as to leave money yet precise in slaughter? Newspapers labelled her death as tragedy, a random act of violence. But in truth, Polly's body was a message, a statement written in blood and horror, and the way her wounds were arranged spoke of training, perhaps medical, perhaps ritualistic, something beyond ordinary madness. Those who had experience with knives recognized cuts that required skill, a precision impossible for a drunk or desperate man, while the women of Whitechapel whispered of a figure in a dark coat who vanished before any eyes could fully comprehend him. Yet the true terror lay not in how Polly died, but why. Her body was the first act in a series that would reveal a chilling pattern. Women, chosen from the shadows, the overlooked, the poor, the dispossessed, turned into symbols, their deaths a language in flesh. One could imagine the Ripper watching as his handiwork was reported, as the newspapers spread the horror, transforming one anonymous life into a spectacle, into a permanent enigma. What the police never admitted, buried deep in their ledgers, is that similar murders had occurred before, hidden in the city's records, clandestine dissections and ritualistic excisions performed in secrecy, long before the term Ripper was whispered. Polly's death was the overture, her wounds the verses, her silence the chorus, and if examined carefully, her body revealed a careful choreography, a message that transcended death. As her corpse was carried away, the name of the killer remained unknown, replaced by a legend, but the legend itself was designed to hide the truth, a name meant to terrify yet to conceal. And in the foggy corners of Whitechapel, the shadow that had struck once lingered, as if satisfied, waiting for the next scene, for the next act of horror to unfold. The city had glimpsed a predator, yet it did not know the scope, the intelligence, or the darkness behind the knife that now became myth. Soon after the killings, letters arrived at police stations, at newspapers, written in red ink, flamboyant, erratic, signed with a name that would haunt history. Jack the Ripper, a name that became larger than any single human. The handwriting suggested madness at first glance, almost playful, yet the words betrayed cunning, a mind not only capable of murder, but of orchestrating public terror with deliberate craft. The press devoured the letters, printing them in full. The police dismissed them as hoaxes, yet their circulation amplified fear. And in those words lay an intelligence far beyond the reach of simple criminals. Among them, the infamous Dear Boss letter mocked authorities, promised further bloodshed, and signed the now immortal name, Jack the Ripper. But in the archives exists another letter, long suppressed, rarely discussed. For it did not recount a murder, but described ritual, sacrifice, and a purpose that transformed the killings from mere crime to a dangerous form of performance. This letter vanished, officially lost, unofficially suppressed, as if the powers in charge feared the consequences of its revelation. The Ripper's identity remains unknown, not because of incompetence, but because obscurity was intended, anonymity, a shield, legend a weapon, a way to strike terror without detection. Each published letter expanded the myth. Each scream in print turned the Ripper into something immortal, a shadow untouchable by law or morality. Whitechapel had a murderer, yes, but London had something far more potent, a story that could not be contained, a legend that spread like wildfire, infecting the city, demanding attention, commanding obsession. The letters remind us that murder was not his only act. Memory was, memory, which lingers, which whispers, which haunts. And perhaps the greatest cut of all is the one left in the mind, the cut from which there is no recovery. Those letters that should not exist are warnings disguised as communication, and in them lies the ultimate terror, the Ripper's final power, to ensure that, centuries later, we are still listening. As night fell over Whitechapel, the fog thickened, curling around gas lamps and cobblestones alike, hiding footsteps, swallowing figures, creating illusions of movement where none existed. Men who dared walk these streets alone reported a sense of being followed, an instinctual knowing that eyes observed from somewhere unseen, that someone, or something, was tracking them. It is said that the Ripper himself moved like the fog, a presence felt but not seen, steps silent, coat brushing against walls, a shadow that bent to the curves of alleyways, slipping in and out of vision, vanishing as soon as recognition threatened, leaving nothing but the faintest scent of antiseptic and smoke, a trace of humanity at odds with the violence he carried. Whitechapel's residents whispered about a figure that could appear in multiple alleys at once, a man with a practiced gait, hands precise, aware of every possible exit, as though the streets themselves guided him, as though he belonged to them more than anyone else. For some, the terror was almost unbearable, a psychological weight pressing into bones, minds bending to imagine horrors that had yet to manifest, because the Ripper was not simply a killer. He was an architect of fear, a teacher of dread, and his classroom was the entire East End. And yet among the darkness there were patterns, subtle hints of order in how he moved, in how he chose his victims, in how he eluded capture, suggesting intelligence, and perhaps a perverse sense of morality, or rules known only to him. Police reports hinted at panic. Men assigned to patrols abandoned their posts, driven to early exits by an instinct they could not name, their lanterns casting long shadows that seemed to twist into faces, mocking their inability to stop what was coming. The fog itself became an accomplice, wrapping around bodies, swallowing the aftermath of each encounter, hiding tracks, muffling screams, giving him both cover and theatre. And as each night passed, fear evolved into legend, legend into obsession, obsession into paranoia, until the people of Whitechapel were living in a continuous state of dread, haunted by a presence they could neither see nor name, a predator whose intelligence was as unnerving as his violence. The Ripper's reign of shadows was not just about killing, it was about control, a subtle psychological domination, where the city itself seemed to bend to his will, where fear became as potent a weapon as the knife he wielded, unseen, unstoppable, eternal in its effect. London's elite, safe behind walls, behind wealth and privilege, read the reports with fascination, thinking the killings belonged to the East End, to the poor, to those they had long ignored, a place where crime and misery were almost expected. But the Ripper's work was subtler than simple murder. He forced the upper classes to watch, to consume headlines, to marvel at cruelty they had previously believed only existed in imagination, and in doing so, he crossed social boundaries without ever leaving Whitechapel. Whispers of ritual, surgical precision, letters designed to provoke and unsettle, suggested something more, a pattern not meant to be noticed by the poor alone, but by those who thought themselves untouchable, those who sat in offices and parlours, managing empires and ignoring the lives of the unseen, doctors, magistrates, journalists. Many speculated, many theorized, but none could name the man. None could predict the next strike. And those closest to the investigation began to fear not only for their lives, but for the integrity of their own minds, for the darkness they glimpsed behind each crime was contagious, spreading like a silent plague of paranoia. The Ripper did not merely exploit Whitechapel. He exploited the very structures of power, turning the fear of the powerless into a weapon against the powerful, a terrifying symphony of control executed in silence, in fog, in shadows, in blood. And still, London turned its head, dismissing the cries of the East End while consuming the spectacle of horror as entertainment. a morbid curiosity that spread like wildfire through newspapers, pamphlets and private letters, ensuring that the myth of Jack the Ripper grew far larger than the man himself could ever be. In this way, the murders became not only a personal terror, but a social commentary, a reflection of a city blind to its own decay, a mirror held to Peter privilege, showing that no amount of wealth or influence could shield one from fear, from chaos, from the shadow that stalked in silence. The elite feared what they could not touch, while the poor feared what they could not escape. And the Ripper thrived in this duality, unseen yet everywhere, present yet untouchable, orchestrating an unspoken lesson in power, in fear, in mortality, and in the fragility of order itself. London had created the Ripper as much as he existed within it, and the city would learn, too late, that some shadows, once born, cannot be banished. Annie Chapman, the second victim, was found in the backyard of a house along Hanbury Street, her body mutilated with a meticulous care that suggested deliberation, her throat slashed in a signature move, yet her abdomen was carved with an intelligence that sent shivers through the investigating officers. The precision of the knife work sparked rumors. Medical knowledge, or perhaps a hand trained in the dissection of human life, a mind that approached murder as both art and statement, and as the body was examined, a message emerged, clear to anyone trained to read beyond the obvious. Annie Chapman's death was a warning, not only to the people of Whitechapel, but to those who might presume that the murders were arbitrary, chaotic, impulsive. Her wounds screamed order in the midst of horror, ritual in the theatre of fear, a structure beneath the apparent madness. The letters continued to arrive, their contents now more provocative, more detailed, some claiming knowledge only the killer could know, confirming that the Ripper was watching, orchestrating, calculating and taunting the police with a disconcerting mixture of pride and mockery. Residents whispered about a figure glimpsed near the scene, tall, shadowy, moving with a calm confidence that made observers doubt their own eyes, as though he could bend the very air to cloak his passage. And this figure became the embodiment of dread, a ghost in life, not death. Yet the killings were not merely about terror. They were about attention, about power, about sending a message that the Ripper controlled the narrative as much as the streets themselves. A predator aware of every move, every observation, every potential interruption. The brutality of the act combined with the subtlety of choice, a combination that confounded investigators, and each act left the city more paranoid, more obsessed, more willing to believe in forces beyond the human, in intelligence beyond comprehension, in evil beyond description. Annie Chapman's death, her body left as a message in the cold dawn, became a lesson in fear, in observation, in the art of manipulation. And for those who sought to uncover the truth, it hinted at a depth to the Ripper that transcended individual murder, suggesting a mind capable of long-term strategy, planning, and an understanding of the fragility of those around him. Whitechapel had witnessed a second act, and the city began to realize that the Ripper was not just a man with a knife. He was a force, a shadow that thrived in darkness, in silence, and in the collective terror of the living. Elizabeth Stride was discovered in Dutfield's yard, a quieter death among the series, her body revealing less mutilation than the others, yet the message remained unmistakable. The Ripper was always watching, always present and yet invisible, a master of misdirection, a shadow slipping between gaslight and darkness. This third killing confused the press, confounded the public, and unsettled investigators, for it suggested a level of control over timing, location, and narrative that indicated intelligence, restraint, and patience, a deliberate pacing designed to build anticipation, to teach fear like a tutor instructing the unwilling. Those who walked the streets at night whispered of watching eyes, the feeling that someone was tracking their movements, analyzing reactions, cataloguing the behavior of humans as prey, and it was not paranoia, for many reports described glimpses of a figure too fleeting to identify, yet always there. The Ripper's understanding of his environment, the city itself, was almost superhuman, exploiting darkness, fog, and human psychology to remain untouchable. And each new act added layers to his legend. Layers designed to confuse, to terrify, to dominate the minds of both the powerless and the powerful. Elizabeth Stride's death was quieter than the others, but the lesson was louder than ever. Control is not always expressed in violence alone. Sometimes it is expressed in observation, patience, and the ability to strike unpredictably, leaving fear to grow in anticipation of the inevitable. The killings, the letters, the rumors, they were not random. They were a symphony of terror, each movement deliberate, each pause calculated. And the audience was London itself, unwitting and terrified, complicit in the spectacle by virtue of attention alone. And yet, for those willing to look closer, to examine the edges of the crime scenes, to read bees, between the lines of reports and letters, hints emerged of a purpose, a pattern that suggested the Ripper was not only a murderer, but a teacher of terror, a master of control, an architect of chaos. Whitechapel had become a stage, London a theatre, and the Ripper, the invisible director, orchestrating a performance whose horror would echo for generations. The eyes that watched were everywhere, in the fog, in the alleys, in the hearts of men, and those who saw them never unlearned the sensation. For the shadow that stalked remained present long after the body was gone, whispering of intelligence, patience, and the ultimate control that only a predator of legend could wield. The fog rolled thick over Mitre Square, curling like smoke from a hidden flame. The night alive with shadows that moved independently. And in that murky half-light, Catherine Eddowes was found, her body mutilated with a precision that spoke of long practice, every cut deliberate, every incision a statement, a signature written in flesh. It was the third killing, yet something had changed. Boldness, confidence, audacity. As if the Ripper knew the city itself bent to his will, as if Whitechapel's alleys had become extensions of his mind, each narrow lane a path he commanded, each doorway a stage for terror. Blood pooled across the stones, reflecting gaslight like a warning, and officers who arrived were confronted not just with murder, but with a calculated spectacle, a message that screamed, "I am here. I control the night. I am unseen, but always watching." Residents whispered of shadows moving where none should, of figures glimpsed at windows before vanishing, a feeling that the very air itself was alive with predation, a presence that could not be reasoned with, negotiated, or outrun. The Ripper's methods were evolving, the artistry of horror becoming more apparent with each victim, suggesting not insanity alone, but intelligence, obsession, ritual, an understanding of human fear that bordered on the supernatural. And yet, the city refused to recognize the lesson beneath the gore. Newspapers turned headlines into entertainment. Society laughed at the spectacle from a safe distance, never realizing that the Ripper's audience was not the poor of Whitechapel alone, but the powerful, the curious, the voyeurs of fear. Catherine's death carried a subtlety that disturbed those who examined it closely. A pattern emerging, hints of a ritual older than London itself, echoes of rites buried in history, forgotten by society, but alive in the shadow that stalked the East End. Every act of violence became a study in control, in psychological dominance, in the careful orchestration of panic, until the city itself was complicit, turning its eyes away yet unable to resist the spectacle, unable to stop watching the horror unfold. The Ripper was no longer just a man with a knife. He was a force, a shape that existed between fog and brick, a mind that toyed with life and death, orchestrating fear with a precision that terrified even those sworn to protect the living. Mitre Square became a symbol, a shrine to the power of darkness, and those who walked past it afterward reported an uneasy feeling, as if the street itself remembered, as if Catherine's screams had been absorbed by the stones and whispered endlessly to anyone who would listen. The Ripper's legend deepened, not by luck, not by chance, but by a meticulous understanding of the human psyche, a patience that turned murder into theatre, and theatre into myth. The police were desperate, their methods increasingly frantic, their morale fracturing beneath the weight of a murderer who refused to be caught. Yet the Ripper did not merely evade capture. He studied them, understood their weaknesses, exploited their assumptions, and manipulated the machinery of law like a master tactician. Officers claimed to see figures disappearing in fog, to hear laughter faint and chilling in alleyways. And while some were dismissed as hysteria, the intensity of reports suggested a predator capable of understanding human perception. Of bending it to his advantage, investigators pored over maps, letters, and body reports, yet the deeper truths eluded them, and every failure strengthened the legend, giving the Ripper both power and anonymity. London itself became an accomplice. The city's streets an extension of the Ripper's mind, as fog and darkness worked to conceal him, while society remained blind to his method, imagining chaos where there was cold design, randomness where there was precision. The letters continued to arrive, taunting, revealing knowledge only a perpetrator could possess, and yet some of the communications contained subtle hints, almost clues, almost confessions, designed not to be seen by the poor, but by those who analyzed, who questioned, who sought forbidden knowledge. And as the killings progressed, the pressure on authorities escalated, their desperation visible in public meetings, in newspaper debates, in the whispered judgments of those who knew the city's underbelly better than any lawman. The Ripper's intelligence was terrifying not because of his violence, but because he understood human systems, manipulating fear to create obedience, attention, and myth, leaving police frustrated, observers horrified, and the city itself in a near-constant state of psychological siege. He had transformed Whitechapel from a district into a laboratory, from fog into camouflage, from stone into witness, teaching all who dared look that intelligence without conscience is a predator the mind cannot escape. London's heart, the seat of empire, became prey to a shadow that existed not in bodies alone, but in thought, in attention, in the obsessive curiosity that made the city turn its eyes over and over again to the horrors he orchestrated. In watching the Ripper, London had become ensnared in his design, and the gaze of authority itself became a tool he wielded, understanding that fear, when properly applied, can shape behavior more powerfully than law or morality. And in this, the Ripper's genius emerged, not merely a murderer, but a teacher of terror, a master of influence, and a shadow whose knowledge of humanity made him untouchable, omnipresent, and immortal in memory. Mary Jane Kelly's death was unlike the others, a crescendo of horror carefully prepared, executed in private, within the walls of her own lodging, and yet the precision, the deliberation, the performance of violence followed the same chilling patterns as before, only magnified, amplified, as though the Ripper had grown bored of public displays and sought an intimacy more terrifying. Her body, discovered amidst the scattered remnants of her life, suggested both ritual and obsession, and the brutality was both familiar and alien, almost a personal message to the city, to investigators, and to anyone daring to watch, a performance written in flesh and blood, a testament to the predator's genius. This killing revealed a deeper pattern, a hidden intelligence behind the previous murders, an attention to symbolism, to placement, to detail that transformed the act from crime to communication. Neighbors reported glimpses of shadows entering her rooms, of whispered noises, of the kind of silence that screams, and in those moments the Ripper became more than a man. He was a presence, an entity that existed between the physical and the psychological, capable of manipulating both body and mind with a terrifying precision. Mary Jane Kelly's death marked the final stage in the Ripper's visible reign, yet it also hinted at truths the city was not ready to face, that these killings were not random, not impulsive, and not merely criminal, but orchestrated, deliberate, and connected to forces long forgotten by the public, hidden in London's history, whispered in forbidden texts, recorded only in the fear of those who survived. The Ripper's work had become a mirror, reflecting the darkness of the city, the corruption of its systems, the ignorance of its citizens, and the fragility of life within its streets, and in doing so, he forced attention, awareness, and obsession upon all West. O'Dowd considered the events. Mary Jane Kelly's final scene was more than murder. It was an epiphany, a lesson, a message encoded in terror and silence, and those who studied the events afterward would recognize the artistry, the intelligence, and the cold calculation. The Ripper had transformed fear into narrative, crime into legend, and murder into philosophy, a shadow that stretched beyond the East End, into the consciousness of all Londoners, and into history itself. His final act, as much as the first, demanded remembrance, reflection, and, for those willing to peer too closely, the dangerous revelation that the Ripper may have been more than a man, more than a murderer, but an idea, an intelligence, a force capable of bending the perception of the living, shaping memory and haunting the city forever. After the last known killing, the fog over London seemed heavier, more persistent, almost sentient, as though the city itself mourned, trembled, or feared the shadow that had walked its streets, invisible yet omnipresent, leaving behind only echoes of violence, whispers of fear, and the imprint of a predator whose intelligence had never been matched. Whitechapel remained a place of whispers, of eyes scanning alleyways, of hearts quickening at the faintest sound. And though the murders ceased, the psychological residue persisted, shaping behavior, instilling caution, suspicion, and paranoia in all who moved through the streets. The legend of Jack the Ripper expanded beyond the East End, into drawing rooms, offices, police precincts, and newspapers across London, creating a mythology of fear that outlived the killer himself, and ensuring that curiosity, fascination, and terror would be forever linked to the name. Those who studied the events later noted patterns, the meticulous planning, the staged brutality, the use of letters to manipulate attention, the psychological dominance over both victims and authorities, and realized that the Ripper's genius was not only in killing, but in creating a cultural and historical shadow, a legacy that persists. London breathed uneasily, caught between relief at the cessation of murders and the awareness that the intelligence behind the acts had vanished, leaving only the myth, the memory, and the unanswered questions, the darkness untouched, unpunished, undefeated. The Ripper's influence extended beyond flesh, beyond crime, beyond history itself. He had taught the city to fear, to doubt, to watch, to question, and in doing so had claimed a power that outlasted death, a dominion over perception and memory, a lesson in the fragility of human control. Even now, centuries later, the streets of Whitechapel whisper, shadows lengthen, and those who walk there at night report the same sensation, being observed, studied, hunted, as though the Ripper's presence never fully left. London learned a dangerous truth. Some shadows, once born, cannot be banished, and intelligence without conscience, when paired with opportunity, leaves a mark far deeper than any wound, far older than memory, far more persistent than time itself. The city remained alive with stories, fear, and fascination, a living testament to the predator who once walked among its fog, unseen, unstoppable, immortal in the minds of those who dared to remember. Even as the killings ceased, an invisible audience lingered, watching from the edges of Whitechapel, in darkened rooms, behind frosted windows, in newspapers read by candlelight, their fascination feeding the legend as surely as blood had fed the streets. The Ripper had taught the city a lesson no one wanted to acknowledge, that fear could be engineered, distributed, and consumed, and that murder was not merely physical. It could be psychological, a weapon more devastating than any blade. In taverns, men whispered theories, claiming knowledge of doctors, butchers, or madmen, yet none dared speak aloud of something deeper, something older, the sense that the killings were tied to a knowledge buried beneath London itself, a knowledge so dangerous it was almost impossible to confront. Historians later discovered hints in forgotten records, strange patterns in medieval documents, mentions of rituals performed under fog and shadow, echoing the precision and horror of the Ripper's methods. And it became clear that someone, or something, had used history itself as a blueprint for terror. The Ripper's invisible audience was not passive. They were active participants, drawing meaning from each act, learning fear, interpreting symbolism, becoming complicit in his legend. Even those who never entered the East End felt the tension, the anticipation, the shaping of perception. The letters had long since stopped, yet their influence persisted. Whispers of intelligence, mockery, ritual and intent creating a network of unease, a psychological trap that extended far beyond Whitechapel's cobblestones, and those who examined the crimes closely realized the truth. The Ripper had not only murdered, he had manipulated, orchestrated and educated through terror, teaching both the powerful and the powerless that observation, attention and fear are tools in the hands of a master, the In. Visible audience became students of horror, carrying the lessons forward, spreading myth, gossip and obsession, until Jack the Ripper existed not as a man, but as an idea, a shadow embedded in the cultural memory of London and the world. Every report, every whispered detail, every hint of pattern became a thread in a tapestry of influence that no law, no authority, no logic could fully unravel. The killer's true audience, it seemed, was not the dead, nor the living nearby, but the collective mind of the city, shaped, manipulated, and forever haunted by a force that could never be fully seen or controlled. And as decades passed, historians, writers and thrill-seekers would look back, tracing each murder, each letter, each rumor, and feel the same sensation residents once did. Eyes watching, fog closing, a knife poised between perception and memory. The police files contained hints, fragments, not meant for public consumption, letters and reports that were deliberately hidden, describing theories, suspects and rituals that were never revealed. Because the truth was more dangerous than fear itself, some suggested the Ripper had access to forbidden knowledge, knowledge that had been suppressed by authorities for decades, a history of human behavior, power, and ritual that, if exposed, might destabilize society's understanding of morality and law. The careful placement of bodies, the timing of attacks, the choice of victims, the detailed correspondence. It all suggested not madness, but calculation, intelligence, and a purpose rooted in something older than Whitechapel, older than Victorian London itself. Historians today speculate that the Ripper's acts mirrored ceremonies recorded in texts buried in private collections, rituals intended to assert dominance, power, and control over communities through fear. Yet all of this remained hidden, dismissed as rumor, madness, or coincidence. Even those who uncovered fragments felt the danger in speaking too loudly, understanding that some knowledge was meant to remain buried, and that curiosity carried a cost, not only to the mind, but to the very soul. London itself had conspired, knowingly or not, to suppress the truth, burying records, sanitizing narratives, and glorifying myth over substance, ensuring the Ripper became legend, and the real meaning of his acts faded into obscurity. The suppressed truths suggested a predator who understood not only the human body but the human mind, manipulating both with precision and leaving clues that could only be interpreted by those willing to risk understanding, to peer too closely into shadows. Each act, each letter, each story hinted at a system, a network, a knowledge that operated above the surface of society, and those who glimpsed it knew instinctively to remain silent, fearful that exposure might awaken forces that had lain dormant for centuries. The Ripper's murders were, perhaps, lessons designed to be partially seen, partially hidden, instructive yet terrifying, shaping perception in a way that made people complicit in his legend even without realizing it. And so the city carried forward a secret it did not fully understand, a shadow of knowledge entwined with fear, a lesson in power, manipulation, and the danger inherent in seeing too clearly. Some truths, it seems, are too potent to survive in daylight, and Jack the Ripper ensured they remained in the fog, whispered, and dangerously alive. Those who studied the crimes carefully noticed subtle patterns, repeated gestures, placements and symbols embedded in the horror, suggesting the Ripper's intelligence was far beyond what the public was allowed to see. Each victim became a node in a network, each act a deliberate punctuation, a rhythm in the macabre, teaching the city a language of fear that could be understood only by those paying attention to the unseen, the small, the deliberate. The cuts were surgical, yes, but more than that. They were communication, subtle signals embedded in flesh and environment, a language almost forgotten, derived from rituals older than London itself, whispered in forgotten texts and suppressed manuscripts. Investigators who recognized the patterns found themselves unsettled, realizing that the killings were connected not only by geography, but by history, by intent, by a kind of intelligence that made law, morality, and logic inadequate to the task of understanding. Every evening, the fog seemed to carry not only the smell of decay, but the residue of calculation, and those walking alone reported a sense of being guided, herded, watched, as though the Ripper's influence extended beyond his physical presence. The network of fear extended outward, affecting perception, behavior, and even thought, creating an architecture of terror that remained invisible yet profoundly real, shaping how people moved, spoke, and imagined danger. The letters, the bodies, the public panic, all became part of the same system, a deliberate weaving of human psychology, geography, and attention, orchestrated to teach the city about power and fear, and the fragility of the structures it relied upon, and the patterns suggested a lesson deeper than murder. That intelligence applied to chaos could create influence more enduring than any physical act, more lasting than memory, and more dangerous than any weapon. Historians later hypothesized that the Ripper may have been part of a lineage, someone who understood forbidden knowledge, the old ways, the manipulations of society through terror, continuing a practice that had been hidden for centuries. Whitechapel itself had become a laboratory, the fog a partner, the residents unwitting participants, the city's authorities the most vulnerable, and the predator, though unseen, became omnipresent, omniscient, and eternal in the psychology he shaped. And so the shadow that walked those streets did more than kill. It taught, it influenced, it inscribed a system of understanding into the fabric of London that would persist long after the fog had lifted and the bodies had decayed. Those infamous letters, long debated, were not just taunts. They were instructions, signals, confirmations, and warnings. Carefully phrased to manipulate public perception and the attention of authorities, some letters were for show, but others were carefully designed to test responses, to observe panic, to measure comprehension, a methodical engagement with both media and law enforcement. The choice of words, punctuation, and style suggested intelligence, patience, and a perverse understanding of psychology, of the way humans respond to threats, fear, and ambiguity. And some historians believe that each letter contained hidden codes, patterns, and references lost to time. The letters that survive today are only fragments. Others were destroyed, suppressed, or lost by those who feared what understanding might reveal. And in the margins of official documents, faint notes hint at knowledge too dangerous to publish, even decades later. For those studying the correspondence, it became apparent that the Ripper's goal was not just to kill, but to communicate, to manipulate attention, to test boundaries, to create a shadow legend that could grow unchecked. The letters were a demonstration of power. Written words could extend influence beyond the physical, could control perception, could create fear without touching a body. A method as effective, perhaps, as the murders themselves. Every recipient, every reader became part of the experiment, part of the audience, absorbing terror, transmitting gossip, and unwittingly spreading the Ripper's design across class, geography, and culture. And the surviving letters hint at a final truth, the one deliberately hidden. The Ripper understood influence, myth, and psychology far better than any contemporary, and had prepared a legacy not merely of murder, but of mental domination. They reveal a predator who existed as much in perception as in flesh, manipulating belief, memory, and attention, and teaching the city lessons it would never unlearn. The letters remain dangerous, not because of their content alone, but because they embody a system of thought, a framework for understanding and exploiting fear, and those who study them too closely risk the same obsession that consumed those who lived through the killings. Jack the Ripper was more than a man, more than a killer. He was a teacher, a manipulator, a shadow intelligence whose lessons persist, echoing in fog, whispers, and the collective imagination of London and the world. Though centuries have passed, the shadow of Jack the Ripper remains, lingering in foggy corners, in history books, in the whispered fascination of those who study the macabre, and it is a shadow that refuses to be fully understood or contained. Whitechapel still carries echoes of the past, faint impressions of the alleys, gas lamps, and silent witnesses who felt the predator's presence. And those who walk there today report an uneasy sensation, as if the streets themselves remember the precision of his movements, the cold calculation in every act, the intelligence behind each cut. The Ripper's influence is not merely historical, it is psychological, embedded in collective memory, in fear, in fascination, teaching the dangerous lesson that intelligence coupled with a lack of conscience is more powerful than law, more persistent than memory, and more terrifying than any visible threat. Every analysis of his acts, every exploration of letters, patterns, and historical documents reinforces the notion that this was no ordinary murderer, no random lunatic, but a mind capable of understanding human behavior on a level few could imagine, manipulating fear, attention, and narrative with surgical precision. The city, authorities, and population became unwitting participants in a long-term experiment, observing, responding, and perpetuating the legend. And in this way, the Ripper transcended flesh to exist as an idea, an intelligence, a predator whose influence outlives mortality. For the modern observer, the danger is not the streets of Whitechapel, but the fascination they provoke, the obsession with patterns, identities, and secrets that may have been deliberately left for those who sought truth too carefully. Some scholars speculate that the murders were a ritual of teaching, a hidden curriculum designed to expose vulnerabilities in society, human perception, and moral structures, forcing reflection, fear, and attention in ways no conventional crime could. The shadow remains in stories, in films, in books, in whispers among men obsessed with hidden forces and forbidden knowledge. And the more one studies, the more the presence feels real, tangible, almost alive, as if Jack the Ripper has never left. History preserves him not merely as a killer, but as a teacher, a manipulator, and a reminder that knowledge, intelligence, and malevolence together create a force few can resist or survive. And for those who dare to study closely, the lesson becomes personal. The shadow can reach beyond centuries, beyond geography, beyond death itself, into the mind of anyone willing to look too deeply into forbidden truths. Fear, it seems, is not instinct alone. It is shaped, honed, taught, and exploited. And Jack the Ripper mastered it like a sculptor, carving terror into the city with every step, cut, and letter. Each murder was a study, each letter a lesson, each act a calculation in the architecture of panic. And the residents of Whitechapel unknowingly became subjects in a psychological experiment of unparalleled subtlety and danger. The human mind, exposed to repeated patterns of violence and mystery, adapts in ways that benefit the predator. Hypervigilance, obsession, mistrust, and compulsion, all of which feed the Ripper's invisible influence, extending the reach of his acts beyond mortality, beyond physical presence, into cognition itself. Historians studying the events note the meticulous placement of bodies, the choice of victims, the orchestration of public and private perception, suggesting a mind that combined medical knowledge, criminal awareness, and psychological insight, a predator whose intelligence allowed him to dominate both life and thought. Even modern psychology recognizes the danger in understanding him too deeply. The letters, patterns, and historical analyses draw obsession, curiosity, and dread, creating the same mental tension experienced by those who lived through the killings, teaching that knowledge itself can be weaponized. The architecture of fear created by the Ripper extends beyond the streets he walked, beyond the newspapers that reported, into the collective consciousness of men who study control, manipulation, and hidden forces, a curriculum in terror that no one enrolled in voluntarily but few can resist. Every gas lamp, every fog-shrouded alley, every whispered name in history contributes to this edifice, constructing a map of anxiety that mirrors the spatial and temporal reach of his actions, turning memory into a weapon, narrative into a trial, a power legend into an intelligence of its own. In this sense, Jack the Ripper did not simply kill bodies. He disciplined perception, molded attention, and cultivated fear, leaving a template for understanding human vulnerability, a method so precise it could only belong to someone who treated the world as both subject and audience. And so, the anatomy of fear emerges, not in the blood alone, but in the mind, the culture, and the memory of London. A structure built by a hand unseen, a mind unseen, and a shadow that refused to vanish, teaching a dangerous lesson about the power of observation, calculation, and psychological mastery. Buried deep in London's archives, beneath layers of bureaucratic neglect, lie hints, fragments, and suppressed documents suggesting the Ripper's knowledge extended beyond what the public ever imagined, touching on forbidden rituals, occult practices, and strategies of influence lost to time. Some historians believe the letters and murders were coded lessons, teaching those who observed too closely about control, human psychology, and the manipulation of society, lessons disguised as crimes and warnings never meant to be fully understood. The archives whisper of patterns unnoticed, of anomalies in police reports, of bodies discovered in precise arrangements, of timing that suggests long-term planning, patience, and a sophistication that elevates Jack the Ripper from criminal to architect of fear. These whispers are dangerous, for understanding them requires courage and caution, the curiosity to peer into the shadows without being consumed by them, and even fragments of truth hint at knowledge powerful enough to disturb, manipulate, and influence generations. The Ripper may have understood the psychology of his time, the weaknesses of authorities, the obsessions of journalists, and the patterns of human attention, applying this intelligence to create terror and myth simultaneously, teaching an audience he never touched, controlling a city he never entered. Historians sifting through the archives sense a hidden curriculum, a dangerous lesson in the structures of society, the nature of fear, and the methods by which intelligence unrestrained by morality can dominate, manipulate, and endure. It becomes clear that his killings were not random, but deliberate, his letters not idle, but purposeful, and the gaps in the archives, the suppressed documents, and the destroyed evidence suggest a level of caution, sophistication, and understanding designed to keep the most day. Garous truths hidden. Whispers in the archives speak of a predator who transcended flesh, manipulating perception and memory, ensuring that those who dared study him too closely would feel the same shadow, hear the same footsteps, and sense the same eyes that haunted Whitechapel long ago. The Ripper exists in history as both subject and teacher, his legacy as much a psychological framework as a criminal record. And the archives, for those brave enough to study them, continue to whisper, teach, and unsettle, a testament to the persistence of intelligence divorced from morality. For those who dig too deeply, a dangerous truth emerges. The Ripper was not merely a product of his environment, nor a lunatic acting on impulse, but a predator with a design, a mind trained in observation, calculation, and the orchestration of fear. Each murder, each letter, each pattern reveals layers of intelligence, ritual, and manipulation, a system designed to teach the city, the police, and the public about the fragility of perception, the obedience of attention, and the power of legend over reality. The Ripper's work extends beyond mortality, influencing behavior, obsession, and the study of human vulnerability across centuries, suggesting that the danger he posed was never only physical, but psychological, social, and cultural. Modern analysis hints at connections to suppressed historical knowledge, texts hidden from public view, rituals once known to secret societies, methods of psychological manipulation practiced in silence, and the possibility that the Ripper had access to intelligence lost to ordinary citizens. This revelation is dangerous because it suggests that understanding the Ripper fully may expose knowledge not intended for public consumption, knowledge that teaches influence, fear, and domination in ways that can be replicated, applied, and weaponized. The danger is not the past, it is the method, the mind, the system that continues to influence how humans think, perceive, and fear. And in studying Jack the Ripper, one risks glimpsing forces that are both timeless and malevolent. The lesson is stark. Intelligence without conscience, observation without morality, and manipulation without restraint can create power greater than any weapon, longer lasting than any life, and more pervasive than any law. Those who confront the Ripper's legacy confront a shadow larger than the streets of Whitechapel, a shadow embedded in culture, psychology, and history, a force that teaches the dangerous lesson that mortality does not limit influence. And in understanding, one realizes that the legend, the fear, and the psychological mastery of Jack the Ripper are not merely historical, they are eternal, dangerous, and still active in the minds of those who seek forbidden knowledge too closely. The final revelation is simple yet terrifying. Jack the Ripper did not die with the last body. His lesson, his shadow, and his system of fear continue to teach those who are willing and curious and bold enough to listen. The Ripper's legacy is more than legend. It is a framework, a set of lessons in fear, attention, and control, encoded in murder, letters, patterns, and cultural memory. And those who study him learn not only about crime, but about human psychology, perception, and vulnerability. Every historian, journalist, and true crime enthusiast who examines his story becomes part of the shadow, a student of terror, an observer of intelligence divorced from morality, a participant in a system the killer designed to endure. The city of London itself has become an accomplice, its fog, alleys, and memory preserving the lessons, ensuring that every generation hears, observes, and feels the presence of a predator who transcended flesh, time, and morality. This legacy is dangerous, not because it incites violence, but because it teaches understanding, perception, and manipulation, the very tools the Ripper used to orchestrate panic, legend, and attention, turning curiosity into an instrument of psychological influence. And in realizing the scope, the system, and the intelligence behind the murders, one begins to grasp the uncomfortable truth that evil can be methodical, intelligent, and enduring, and that the greatest power lies not in the act of killing, but in shaping minds, culture, and memory. Jack the Ripper remains a shadow that instructs, influences, and haunts. His legacy, a dangerous mirror reflecting the weaknesses, fears, and obsessions of those who study him, teaching that understanding too much can be perilous, that knowledge is power, and that power without morality is a force to be feared. Whitechapel, history, archives, and imagination all serve as classrooms, and every reader, listener, or observer of the legend becomes a student, learning the lessons, sensing the shadow, and feeling the subtle but undeniable manipulation of perception. The shadow exists beyond the alleys, beyond time, beyond mortality, teaching that control, observation, and fear are weapons as potent as the knife itself. And the true horror is not the past, but the enduring system left behind, still active, still teaching, still dangerous. Those who walk the streets, read the archives, and study the letters carry the shadow with them, a reminder that intelligence applied without conscience is eternal, invisible, and terrifying. Jack the Ripper's lesson persists. The mind is both prey and battlefield, and those who enter it without caution may never emerge unchanged. The final lesson is the most dangerous of all. Jack the Ripper was more than a man. He was a system, a teacher of terror, a practitioner of forbidden knowledge that allowed him to manipulate perception, fear, and attention beyond what law, morality, or mortality could contain. The murders, letters, and patterns form a curriculum, subtle yet exact, teaching students of fear, history, and psychology about the architecture of control, the manipulation of society, and the enduring power of intelligence divorced from ethics. Whitechapel was the classroom, London the audience, the world the observers, and those willing to study too closely risk inheriting the lessons, the shadow, and the obsession that consumed both victims and witnesses. Suppressed documents, whispers in archives, and hints in forgotten manuscripts suggest the knowledge Jack the Ripper wielded was not purely criminal, but deeply strategic, ritualistic, and psychological, a combination of observation, cunning, and ancient methods designed to endure. To understand the Ripper fully is to encounter forbidden knowledge, to confront the architecture of fear, and to feel the subtle domination of perception, attention, and memory. lessons that continue to echo across time, fog, and imagination. The danger lies not in replication, but in comprehension. The moment one grasps the system, the methodology and the intelligence, the mind recognizes the terrifying reality that intelligence applied without conscience is unstoppable, invisible, and eternal. Jack the Ripper's presence persists, not as flesh and blood, but as structure, shadow, and curriculum, teaching all who dare study him the power of observation, the danger of curiosity, and the potency of fear itself. And for those willing to listen, to read, to observe, to think too deeply, the lesson is unavoidable. Some truths were never meant to be known. Some patterns were never meant to be traced, and some shadows, once born, never leave. The fog of Whitechapel, the gaslit streets, the alleys, and whispers carry forward the dangerous knowledge, the forbidden curriculum, and the legacy of a predator who transcended death to instruct, dominate, and haunt. Jack the Ripper is no longer a man, no longer a murderer. He is a shadow intelligence, a system of fear, and a dangerous teacher whose lessons persist for any who dare uncover them, whispering still through history, imagination, and the mind. And as one considers his legacy, one realizes the most chilling truth. Some knowledge is forbidden not for secrecy alone, but because comprehension itself is dangerous, and the Ripper's lesson remains eternal, unseen, and terrifyingly alive.